Oh my gosh, you did it. You built the teapot, you have all the different functioning parts, you have all the different body parts, and you are ready for the very last step, which is adding textures and details and just cleaning it up and making it look amazing. I'm going to start this demo by talking about textures. And I already have a demo video in which I showed a lot of different textures, so some of this will be review if you've already watched that, but review is a great thing. It helps bring those things to the front of our mind so that we can utilize them again in intelligent ways. So we'll start with texture, work in details, and talk about those finishing steps that really take this piece from being something that's pretty nice to amazing, which you are all capable of doing. So have some fun with this step. Take your time and really dig into making some cool textures and surface qualities on your piece. Have fun. Let's talk texture. We're going to start with a fur texture, and I'm going to show you two different ways to do it. If you'd like, you can also watch a texture video that I posted a few weeks back that goes over lots of different textures, might give you some different ideas as well, but I'll show you two common ways to do a fur texture. For the first route, I'm going to use this hook end tool here. I'm going to clean off the edge of it, and all I'm going to do is simply use the back side of it, so not the curved, but I'm going to kind of go in what you'd assume to be the back side, and I'm going to lay in lots of little marks that flow in the direction of the fur on my animal. So for this step, you really need to make sure that you're paying attention, that you're looking at images of how the fur flows around each part of your animal as you draw it in. All right, you can see that leaves a nice little texture behind. There's some areas where my clay was more wet where there's little balls of clay that are left behind. If you let this set up and dry a little bit, you'll be able to brush those off a little bit later. Some mistakes that my students do when they do this method is instead of using the back side of this hook tool, they'll come in with this needle tool and they'll use this instead. Or they'll use the hook side of it, not the back side, and they'll come in this direction. Now, there's no hard and fast, don't ever do this in art kind of thing, but what I can tell you is needle tool making that fur texture doesn't turn out looking very fur-like. What it does is it just creates a long crevice in your space. This makes like a wider line that gives the impression of fur, and it works a lot nicer with the glaze. You can kind of see that here just looking at the fur that I drew in here versus that needle tool fur. It's just too much of a hard line going into the surface. So that's route number one for fur. Avoid the needle tool and avoid any sharp edge tool. You don't want these sharp, deep crevices. You want a nice, smooth line. If you don't like how the texture looks, go in and smooth it out and come back and add back in. The shorter that you draw the line and the lighter that you draw it in, it makes it look like it's thinner, finer fur. So here on the snout, I have thinner, finer fur. Here, as the furs come back towards the back of the head, I'm pushing a little bit more and increasing the length of the stroke. You can also see I move the tool around a little bit so it's not perfect, right? And that creates a different sense of fur through that space. One other mistake kids will make with fur is they won't put enough lines. If you look at the fur that I've drawn in, there's a mark pretty much everywhere there's fur. A lot of students will just do a few marks. They do this when they draw too. This doesn't look like fur. That looks like you scraped up a solid surface. This looks more like fur, so make sure you use enough lines. The second route to making fur is illustrated in a piece of student work that I'm going to show you. This beautiful pup was made by a student named Emerson. It hasn't been fired yet, but if you look, you can see that Emerson has really built out different kind of chunks of fur on her fluffy little pup, and utilized a technique similar to what I just did with my hooked tool to come in and add the texture on top of those chunks or clumps of fur. This is a super effective method. It takes more time and more effort, and there's a chance of breakage, but it's a really interesting, beautiful way to break up the coat of an animal, especially for a pup like this one that has quite a fluffy coat on it. For this method, you're going to need to slip and score. I'm going to avoid the slipping and scoring just because of time. I'm going to start where the back of the fur would be, and I'm going to work my way forward. So I'm going to say that his head gets fluffier as it moves back here. I'd make a chunk of clay, slip and score, and I would blend it forward. And I would keep doing that over and over again. And as I get closer to the front of the head where there wouldn't be as much fluff, I'm gonna get smaller shapes. At this point, I've laid in kind of the fluffy, chunky bits of the fur, and I'm gonna take my tool and I'm gonna do some of the same technique that I did before and just kind of flow with each chunk, starting from the back, moving forward. And you can see that gives kind of a totally different type of furry texture. And maybe you break up, come in like I am here, and break up a little bit of the shape of those fur edges, just a little bit, just so there's some variation in there. And you get a much fluffier kind of look to your fur. A very different type of dog would have that fur animal than would have this fur. Another thing to think about an animal like this is they often have whiskers. And while we're not going to put whiskers in, what you can do is little pinpricks, which at least gives the impression of those whiskers pushing into the skin in the spaces where whiskers push into the skin. Make sure that you add fur everywhere. Move your animal around. And once you've added your texture, you want to make sure not to touch it because it'll smush it down. Don't forget the backs of the ears, the inside of ears, what those look like. And I even went in and I broke these shapes up just a little bit more because I felt it looked a lot more natural to do so. All right, let's look at some feather textures. For little feathers, I really like to use a tool like this that has a little V shape at the end. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to push that into my clay in the direction that the feathers go, and I build out from the front back. This works really well for small little feathers like you'd see on the head of a bird, on a lot of the body of the bird. It doesn't work as well for textures of feathers on the tail or the wing. I'll show you a different method for that in a moment. Again, make sure that you have your feathers flowing in the right direction in different parts of the body. So as you do each section, make sure you find some pictures of that section and pay attention to how those feathers flow around. Just like the fur, you want to make sure you use enough marks to indicate that that whole surface is covered. As I move back further on the head of the bird, I notice that the feathers get larger. So I'm going to start to use a little bit more of that V to get a slightly bigger feather texture in here. Look how easy and effective that texture is. It just takes time, like all great things take time. Larger feathers, you're really going to want to draw in. So I'm going to do larger feathers over here, even though this wouldn't naturally be a part of the piece. And I'm going to pop in a little clip of a student who did a beautiful job with this. What you do for larger feathers is you draw in the shapes. So again, you really got to look at how the feathers are shaped, how they overlap each other, and how they interact. So I'm drawing in the shapes of the feathers. I'm noticing how they interact. Then I'm going to carve down and away where one feather overlaps another. So this is going to look messy for a little bit. So I'm going to carve this feather down because it's underneath the other feather. So if it's under a feather, you carve the top of it down and kind of taper to the base. Okay, now I've got messy feathers overlapping other feathers. Now trust me, okay, this is gonna turn out really nice. You just have to be patient. I'm gonna go in at this point and kind of clean up all my edges first. I wanna get rid of all these little crumbly bits of clay, so I'm just gonna use my tool to pull those out. And then I would use a paintbrush, a soft paintbrush with a little water on it. And I'm just gonna use that to come in and kind of clean up those shapes. Now I could leave my feathers at this point where I've just kind of cleaned them up and you can see their shape. And if there were a lot of these, this would create just a really nice feeling of feathers. What's really nice though, and it takes some time, is if you go in and you draw in the texture of the feathers. So I've drawn in the feather texture. At this point, I really need to let it set up, And then I'm gonna come back and clean up some edges and do some undercutting to separate the look of the feathers from each other so you can see how the end product of that would look. The last texture I want to talk about is kind of a scaly texture, more of an amphibian texture. So I'm going to show you a couple different ways to do that. I am making a frog, and here on this guy, I made this texture by using a slightly dull pencil and just poking it repeatedly over and over again. And if you look, those pokes are right up next to each other. There's no space between them. So make sure if you're doing this technique, you're not doing one little poke every centimeter, but you're really layering those up so that that whole surface has a lovely texture. On my bigger frog, on my teapot, I want to have a larger texture. So I'm going to find another tool, this is the end of a paintbrush, that I can use to do a similar process, but on a slightly larger scale. And I'm just going to layer those marks up over and over and over again until I've built the texture on the entire surface. See how much more interesting the skin looks with that texture on it? It feels a lot more interesting to look at. And it also helps us hide any little and subtle mistakes that we might have. Another route that you might want to take is scales. And in my texture video, I show a technique to make scales in which you take an object like this or the end of a marker cap and you just repeat, and I'll do it on the bottom of his mouth here. You just kind of push it in at an angle and you overlap rows so the center of the circle comes down to the point of the arch above it, and you build in a scale texture like so. That's a pretty easy way to build in scales. If you want to up the ante a little bit, you can treat those scales just like you did your feather and carve away a little bit at the base of each scale where it's overlapped by the one that comes before it. You can always go in and you can draw your shapes and carve them out. I wouldn't suggest carving in a shape and just leaving the line. That won't feel quite right. So if you're going to carve in your shape, you also have to carve down into it, just like we did with our feathers. So carve it in and carve it down. Make it really feel like a scale that lifts up into space. It's going to take you a lot of time, but in the end, it's a texture that's, I think, quite worth it if you're willing to put in that time. Okay, with a little bit of cleanup, that's going to make a really interesting scaled texture on the surface of my amphibian or my lizard or whatever scaly animal I have. And you can see how that's a much more present and visible kind of texture. And remember, when you're building texture, we're going to glaze these eventually. That glaze is going to fill in your texture. So you always want to make your texture more apparent in the piece than you would want it in the end product, because as we get towards the end, you're going to lose a lot of that texture to the glaze itself filling those gaps. But look how lovely of a scale texture that is. Lovely. Just take your time. I would maybe fiddle around with a couple different textures on some scrap clay before you commit to something on your piece itself, just so that you go in feeling confident with the method you're going to use, feeling like it's the right fit for your piece. Here are my finished texture examples. I've got fluffy fur. Make sure you really dig in there, layer up different sections. I've got a smoother fur. Make sure you use enough lines everywhere that you need. You've seen me go in and add whiskers, details of the nose, the mouth. Make sure you take your time to add those facial details. And all the techniques that we used on the face, we can use on other parts of the body too. So take a look at what you see when you look at your reference images and utilize that to problem solve some solutions. On the bird, I finished the small and medium textures on this side of the head, and I finished the feathers on this side. I had to do some cleanup. It's still not quite as neat as I'd like through here. I went around each feather and I did a little bit of an undercut underneath each feather. And then I came in with a nice clean tool and I just used the bottom of this to gently press the feather quill texture into each little piece. So I'll probably go in and do a little bit more cleanup on that section, but you're starting to get a sense of what that bigger feather texture can look like. On the beak, to make it nice and smooth, I used a paintbrush to smooth it out, a paintbrush and water. Then I just used my fingers to burnish it, which is the best way to get a really nice, smooth, even texture. So I did the basic cleanup with water, and now I'm going to use my fingers to burnish or rub to smooth that out. The last thing I'm going to do is kind of remake my nostrils, because in the process of brushing and burnishing, I lost a little bit of those nostrils there. So I'm going to come in and poke those holes back in, pull that back down. So make sure as you add texture that you double check edges and lines, and if you need to remake edges and lines, take the time to pull those back in there. Don't let them get mushed in the process of building your texture. You can always pull that information back in. On my lizard example here, I've got kind of a poked small texture. I've got the texture of the round tool to make a basic scale texture, and then a more advanced and interesting texture of scales on this side. Whatever your texture and whatever your details, what you need to do is take your time, really study what you're building and what your animal looks like, and use the artist's greatest tool, and that is problem solving. So problem solve those textures. Now I am ready to add texture and finishing touches to my frog teapot. I've gone in and I've cleaned the whole thing up with a brush and some water, smoothed out areas that needing smoothing out with my hands, made sure I have all the parts that I need, got my lid in. It fits pretty nicely. I've got a little bit of cleanup to do on that when I get to that stage or that place on my piece. And at this point, it's all details and it's texture. I have images of my frog. I've got a little three-dimensional frog that I'm using as a reference that I built. I've got my clay ready. I've got all my tools ready to go, and I'm just going to work at this point. I'll pause the video here and there to tell you what I'm doing, but it's mostly going to be adding a little here, taking a little way there, putting on texture, perfecting shapes. Eventually I'm going to get to my feet. I'll carve those in, and I'll talk about that at that point, and I'll be adding some details to the flower here, and I'll talk about that at that point too. If you look at the surface that I'm working on, it's pretty clean. I've got a new paper towel that I've put underneath this. I've gotten rid of all the little bits of clay. I've gone to the bottom side of this piece, and remember, when you're turning things over, take that lid off. Cleaned it up some. I still need to clean it up more, but I'm really getting to a place where I need to keep my workstation clean so that my piece will stay nicely put together. At this point, I'm going to fast forward the video, and you can just kind of watch as I work. At this point, I've got about a little over half my texture done, and my hand's getting a little tight. And in the process of adding texture and looking a little bit more carefully at the face, I'm realizing I made a little bit of a mistake with the nose. So I'm going to give myself a break from that stippled texture, and I'm going to fix the nose. At this point, I have all the basic texture done on the body. I've gone in and I've burnished the belly, a little bit around the lips of the frog and things like that as well. I fixed some of the features of the face. And now what I'm going to work on is doing some of the smaller, more delicate details. So I want to add petals to my flower. I want to add toes to my feet. And I want to add a little fly as a pole on the frog. I'm going to take my lid off to do the next step, but to add the flower details on this piece, I'm gonna carve in some petals, and I'm gonna add a couple that kind of stick off a little bit. And it's just a process of adding and taking away some comparisons and things like that. This clay on my frog right now is getting quite hard, so it's gonna be really important that I score this and I put adequate slip on the flower bud and really do a nice job of blending my new clay pieces on here. Same goes for the frog. I finished up my details on my flower. I've also gone in and cleaned up around my lid a little bit. So I just used a loop tool to come in and kind of clean edges. I did the same on this part of the lid as well. I need to go in and brush it. Make sure that final fit is really good. It should just fall right in there with a little extra room all the way around. If you've got a bigger gap like I have back here, you might want to add a little extra clay to either the lid or the flange. And I have a little bit of a rock in my lid, which means I have a high point somewhere in there that I could scrape down. At this point, I want to start carving in my toes. So I was looking at images of frog toes, and they've got 3 that I can see on the back foot. And the middle one is really long, and the one on left and right is a little shorter. So what I'm going to do is go in and kind of define where those toes are, and I'm going to start carving them out of this clay. They're pretty small and they're pretty delicate, so I didn't want to put them in here until this point because I didn't want them to break as I was working on my piece. And at this point, I've got a couple small delicate pieces that I really need to be careful of. 1 is the flower, 2 is that lid. I don't want to drop the lid, so you saw when I was working on the flower, I took the lid off. The last thing that I need to add to that lid is a lid pull. It's going to be a little fly, and I'll show that to you as I get closer to that part. I'll make the fly separate, then I'll add it to that lid pull. I just want to make sure I get that fly done and on the lid pull before that lid dries, because the lid is very small on a very big clay body. It's going to dry quickly when it dries, or as it's drying, and it already is. So I just need to be careful with that. I finished up my flower. I added all of his toes. I went in and added a lid pull that's a little fly. I made some grooves in that lid pull. It's a little wider than a sheet of copper because my wings will be copper that I put in after it's been fired and glazed. I've cleaned up the inside of the lid, both inside and outside. I've redone some textures that got a little mushed in the process of finishing this up. And I just double checked that everything looks great. Then I went in with this tool, a little hook tool, and I'm going to do some undercutting around all my edges. So I undercut, made a little line that runs parallel with the surface, not down into the surface, but parallel around the edges of my piece. So I made an undercut around the flower, around all his toes and his body where it meets the lily pad, where his legs meet his body, the leg folds, just to make sure that areas where it's not supposed to be connected to something else looks like it's separate. So go in and do those little touches. Make sure your spout is nice and clean and that you're all ready to go. At this point, I'm going to start the process of drying out this teapot. Because there's some pretty delicate areas and some pretty thick areas, when I dry out this teapot, I want to do so in such a way that it dries really nice and slowly. So I'm gonna drape it in plastic in the kiln room so it dries slow. If it dries too quickly, things could separate from each other. I hope you really enjoyed your piece and you feel so, so proud of it. I'm really excited for the next step of working with you on this, and that is glazing.